On a river that once burned the color of blood, the night itself seemed to breathe. Flames danced on the water, licking the mist with tongues of fire. Broken arrows floated like dead leaves. The cries of men faded into the wind. And there, amid smoke and chaos, stood a lone figure, his armor torn, his sword still wet with battle. A young Vietnamese general, barely 20, facing the vast Mongol horde. The invaders had crushed kingdoms from the deserts of Persia to the walls of Europe. Yet here, on a muddy riverbank in the small kingdom of Đại Việt, they met something they could not name. It was not just resistance, it was defiance that burned brighter than fear. The Mongol commander rode forward, his laughter echoing across the carnage. "Surrender," he said, "and I will make you a king in the north." The young general's lips curled into a faint smile. His voice, calm but cutting through the night, would echo across centuries. "I would rather be a ghost of the south than a king of the north." The words fell like thunder. Even the torches trembled. He knew he would die within moments, but that did not matter, because sometimes a single sentence can outlive an empire. As the Mongols drew their blades, he stood tall, eyes fixed on the southern sky, where his homeland waited, free. His name was Trần Trọng. In the 13th century, the world trembled under a single banner, the banner of the Mongol Empire. From the frozen plains of Siberia to the deserts of Persia, from the gates of Baghdad to the walls of Hungary, no army had ever ridden so far, so fast, or so fearlessly. Cities burned, empires bowed, kings disappeared like dust in the wake of hooves. And at the center of this unstoppable storm stood Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis, ruler of half the known world. But for all his conquests, his gaze was never satisfied. Beyond the South Seas lay a small green strip of land, a kingdom few in his court even knew by name. Its people called it Đại Việt. To the Mongols, it was nothing, a narrow land of rivers and rice fields, far from the deserts and steppes that had shaped their power. But to its people, it was everything. It was home. A land small in size, but vast in spirit. While the Mongols thundered across continents, Đại Việt lived by the rhythm of the monsoon, planting, harvesting, and defending what the land gave them. They had fought off empires before, the Chinese dynasties, the southern kingdoms, and learned that freedom, once lost, is never easily regained. When Kublai Khan crushed the Song dynasty of China, he turned his eyes southward. If the great Song had fallen, how could this small country stand? So, in the winter of 1284, he sent an army, not one, but two. One would sweep down from the north under his son Prince Togon, known to the Vietnamese as Trois Toan. The other would rise from the south, led by Trois Do, coming up from the conquered lands of Champa. Between them, 500,000 men, steel, fire, and ambition moving to crush a nation barely the size of one of their provinces. In the royal capital of Tonglong, word of the invasion arrived like thunder. The Tran dynasty, young, proud, untested, faced an empire that ruled from Korea to the Caspian Sea. Many whispered of surrender. Some urged peace. But then, in the great court, a question was asked by the emperor himself. Should we fight, or should we yield? The hall fell silent. Then one by one, the elders rose. Farmers, soldiers, scholars, their voices growing into a single roar that shook the pillars of the palace. Fight! It was not the voice of defiance. It was the voice of survival. A vow that this land, however small, would not kneel. Among those who listened that day was a young general, quiet, steady, his gaze sharper than his sword.
He did not speak much. He didn't need to. His loyalty spoke louder than words. His name was Trần Bình Trọng, descendant of royal blood, heir to generations of warriors who had defended the land before him. Some said he was born under a war star. Others said he was the living spirit of the three great dynasties, Li, Tran, and Lei, united in one man. But in truth, he was simply what his nation needed most, a man who believed that honor was worth more than life. As winter deepened, the Mongol armies began to move. The ground trembled beneath their horses. Smoke rose from the northern hills, and across the Red River Delta, temples sounded their bronze bells, not for worship, but for war. The storm was coming, and at its heart would stand one man, young, steadfast, and unyielding, whose courage would light the path through darkness. Winter, 1284. The cold winds from the north carried more than just frost. They carried the scent of iron and ash. Across the border, the Mongol army gathered like a living mountain. Banner after banner rose against the gray sky, each marked with the symbol of a world that believed it could not be defeated. Drums thundered, horses screamed. To the north, Prince Toghan raised his sword. To the south, Tuado readied his fleet. Between them lay Đại Việt, a land barely visible on their maps, yet about to carve its name into eternity. In the capital of Thăng, Emperor Trần Bình Trọng stood beside his general, Trần Hưng Đạo, known to his people as the guardian of the nation. They had seen the fate of kingdoms swallowed by the Mongols, but the emperor's eyes did not waver. There would be no surrender, no tribute, no bowing of heads. This time, they would meet the empire of horsemen with something stronger than fear, with faith. Messengers galloped through the countryside, calling every able man to arms. From the rice fields came farmers with sickles turned into spears. From the fishing villages came men who knew the river's every turn and current. Temples became armories, villages became fortresses. Even the rivers seemed to prepare for battle, their currents running faster, angrier. But courage alone could not stop an empire. The Tran court knew they must fight not with size, but with strategy, not with brute force, but with patience. So the generals planned. Retreat when the enemy advances, burn the crops, empty the cities, let the land itself become a trap. It was a cruel plan, born not of weakness, but of wisdom. A plan to let the invaders starve on the very soil they came to conquer. Yet to make such a plan work, someone had to stand and hold the line. Someone had to buy time for the emperor and his army to retreat, regroup, and strike back. That task fell to a man who never asked for glory. His name was already whispered with respect, Trần Bình Trọng, a commander known for calm in chaos. Hưng Đạo trusted him, not because he was loud or famous, but because when others hesitated, he did what needed to be done. One bitter morning, word came that a Mongol detachment under General Ne Huang had broken through the northern passes. 5,000 horsemen, swift and merciless, chasing the Vietnamese rear guard. If they broke through, the retreating royal army would be trapped. Trần Bình Trọng volunteered to face them. He took a few hundred men, not enough to match the enemy, but enough if courage counted for anything. The Mongols pursued deep into a narrow valley known as Huy Mong Quan, the Gate of Ghosts. Cliffs loomed on both sides, the path twisting like a serpent.
The air grew heavy, silent. Even the horses began to snort uneasily. Then, a drumbeat. 1, 2, 3. A storm of arrows rained from above. The valley erupted. Boulders tumbled. Trees fell. Fire flashed in the mist. Trapped between mountain and man, the invaders had nowhere to run. Panic spread. Their formation was shattered. From the smoke rode Trần Bình Trọng, his sword glinting like lightning. He cut through their line like wind through grass. In moments, the valley became a furnace of sound, steel on steel, men screaming, the hiss of arrows meeting flesh. When the dust settled, 5,000 Mongols lay dead. The Gate of Ghosts had lived up to its name. As dawn broke, the surviving Vietnamese gathered amid the wreckage. Their commander stood silently, the rising sun turning his armor to bronze. One officer urged, "My lord, we should take the side paths. The enemy might send more riders." Tran Bình Trọng only smiled. "If we eat our king's rice, we must stand where our king commands. I will not run. Let them come." The officer bowed, unable to speak. For the first time, his men understood the quiet power of their leader. It was not the strength of arms, but the stillness of a man who feared nothing. Not death, not defeat, not the endless march of empire. That day, the retreating Vietnamese army escaped safely. Behind them, Quy Mon Quan fell silent again, but its stones remembered. Because courage leaves marks even where blood is washed away. And as the Mongol armies pressed deeper into Đại Việt, the legend of Trần Bình Trọng began to grow. The man who turned a mountain pass into a graveyard and a defeat into the promise of victory. Spring, 1285. The rivers of Đại Việt ran red. From the north came Tuat Huan, Kublai Khan's son, his banners black against the clouds. From the south, Tao Do's fleet carved through the sea, their ships thick with warriors and flame. Between them, the small kingdom of Đại Việt braced itself like a reed in the storm, bending but not breaking. Thang Long, the royal capital, burned. Its streets were empty, its granaries torched, its gates wide open. The Mongols entered expecting triumph, but found only silence. No cheers, no captives, no spoils, just ashes and ghosts. The land itself had vanished beneath their feet. Because before the enemy came, the people of Đại Việt had already gone. Villages emptied, fields flooded, crops destroyed by their own hands, so the invaders would have nothing to eat. The empire that devoured nations found itself starving. Furious, Tuat Huan ordered pursuit. He sent his feared general O Ma Ni to hunt down the fleeing royal court. The emperor Tran Yon Tong and the retired king Tran Tong Tong fled south toward the Red River, toward a place called Tien Mok. It was there that fate waited. Night fell heavy over Tien Mok. Mist rolled across the river, thick as breath. Somewhere in the darkness, oars dipped into water. The royal fleet, silent and small, moved like shadows between the reeds. At the front stood a young general, his armor scorched from past battles, his eyes unblinking. He had volunteered to stay behind, to guard the rear, to hold the river until the kings were safe. He knew what that meant. His name was Trần Bình Trọng. He turned to his men, 600 soldiers, weary but resolute. He said only one thing: "As long as I am here, the enemy shall not cross this river." The men nodded. No one spoke again. They knew the night would not end for them. Across the river, the Mongol vanguard approached, torches flickering, the sound of drums growing louder. The reflection of fire on the water looked like a gate to hell opening. But the river had secrets.
For days, Trần Bình Trọng had studied its currents, the bends, the shallows, the reeds that hid wooden stakes beneath the tide. He had turned the river into a living trap. He raised his hand. A single spark rose into the night. 1, 2, 3. Then silence. And from the dark, a whisper of steel. The hiss of hundreds of arrows released at once. They flew low, skimming the surface of the water like silver fish. The first Mongol boat splintered, the next caught fire. Men screamed as oil and flame devoured the river's surface. The smell of burning flesh mingled with the scent of mud and smoke. But the Mongols did not stop. They pushed forward, their ships ramming through wreckage, the roar of drums shaking the air. The Vietnamese lines tightened. Trần Bình Trọng stood on the prow, shouting orders through the storm of fire. His voice carried over the chaos, steady, commanding, "Hold the line, hold the river." Arrows struck his armor. He pulled one out, then another, blood running down his sleeve. Still, he did not fall. The battle raged for hours, steel clashing, men falling into the river, torches dying in the mud. And when the last royal ship finally slipped into the fog, bound for safety, the general knew his duty was done. But he also knew his fate was sealed. At dawn, the water turned still. The river was quiet again, too quiet. The last of his men stood beside him, their faces blackened with soot and ash. Behind them, the banks of Tianmak were littered with bodies, friend and foe alike. They had held the line, but the enemy came again, endless as the tide. The 6th Mongol assault broke through. His soldiers fought hand to hand until the last spear snapped, until the last arrow was spent. When he was finally overwhelmed, he was bleeding from a dozen wounds. They bound him in chains. When they dragged him into Tuat Huan's camp, the Mongol prince smiled. Here was the man who had halted his army, who had turned a river into a graveyard. Even in defeat, he looked unbroken. Tuat Huan rose from his throne and spoke through a translator. "You are brave. I will not deny that. Serve me, and I shall make you a king in the north. You will live in luxury for the rest of your days." The tent fell silent. All eyes turned to the prisoner, to the young man with blood on his face and fire in his eyes. He laughed, softly, almost kindly. Then he said the words that would become immortal. "I would rather be a ghost of the south than a king of the north." No one breathed. Even the guards froze. Tuat Huan's smile vanished. He ordered the execution at once. They led the general to the riverbank where the battle had raged the night before. The air still smelled of smoke and salt. He stood tall, refusing to kneel. The soldiers hesitated. They said his gaze was too calm, too human, as if he were already part of something larger than death. When the sword fell, he did not flinch. The river took him gently, as though welcoming one of its own. News of his death spread like wildfire. Across the land, from the Red River Delta to the coastal plains, his name became a whisper, and then a roar. The man who chose death over dishonor had become more than a soldier. He had become a mirror for a nation. In the villages, peasants spoke his name before they marched. In the camps, soldiers carved his last words into their shields. And in the royal court, Chen Hongdao swore that his sacrifice would be not in vain. The strategy changed. The retreat became an ambush. The ambush became an uprising. The Mongols thought they were chasing victory, but they were being led into the jaws of defeat. Every river turned hostile. Every village became a trap. Bamboo forests whispered warnings. Smoke rose from unseen fires. It was as if the land itself had risen to avenge its fallen son.
In the summer of 1285, Tuat Do, the southern general, was surrounded and slain at Tai Ket. Tuat Huan's northern army collapsed soon after. The invincible empire fled in panic, their prince escaping north, hidden inside an iron tube, crawling home through the same mud that had once defied them. And above it all, the Red River flowed on, carrying away the blood of the battle, carrying forward the memory of a man who had stood alone between two worlds. When the chronicles of Đại Việt were written, historians could not find words great enough to contain him, so they wrote only what mattered. He died standing. That was enough, because in every age, there comes a moment when a nation is measured not by its armies, but by its courage. And in that moment, on the banks of Tianmak, Đại Việt proved it was unbreakable. Centuries have passed since that morning on the Red River. The world has changed, empires have risen and fallen, but the wind over Tianmak still carries the same quiet strength. Some nights, the fishermen say they can hear the whisper of oars in the mist, or the clash of unseen swords under the moonlight. They say the river remembers. and perhaps it does. For the Vietnamese people, Tran Binh Trang was never just a man. He was the living answer to an ancient question: what is freedom worth? He left no great monument, no palace of marble or gold. His monument was the soil itself, the fields where his people sowed again after war, the schools and streets that now bear his name, the temples where children still bow and listen to his story. He was only 26 years old when he died, but his words have lived for 700 years. I would rather be a ghost of the South than a king of the North. For some, it was defiance. For others, it was love, the kind of love that asks for nothing in return. It was not a cry for war, but a promise of dignity. And that promise still echoes in every moment a people chooses honor over comfort, courage over silence, truth over fear. A small nation once stood before the largest empire on earth and survived, not because it was rich, not because it was strong, but because it remembered who it was. History is not made by kings alone. Sometimes it is shaped by a single voice, a man who stood by a river and chose honor over life. His courage reminds us that freedom is never given. It is chosen again and again by those who refuse to kneel. If you believe that courage has no borders, that history lives in the hearts of those who remember, then stay with us. Subscribe and journey with us into the stories where humanity meets eternity.